this episode, I want to talk about the beautiful Pearl Bryan, a beautiful young lady whose life was taken far too early. She was the youngest child of Alexander and Susan Bryan. Alexander was a successful businessman in the town of Greencastle, Indiana. He was a farmer, and they lived on a farmhouse just only a couple of miles outside of the main town. The whole family was well respected, and so far as Pearl's concerned, everybody adored her. They all said that she was a very amiable young lady, willing to help anybody. She was very active in the community, always willing to give a hand, active in the church. Pearl went to high school and graduated high school. When she graduated from the Greencastle High School, the position that she took up as a paid job was that of a Sunday school teacher. Apparently everybody loved her there too, and she was well liked. So a very upstanding young lady. But this brings us to the men in Pearl's life. Scott Jackson. Let's start with him, shall we? Scott moved to Greencastle a year before Pearl was murdered. He lived with his mother in Greencastle, next door, in the home next door to Pearl's second cousin, William Wood. And that indeed is how Pearl came to meet Scott. Scott didn't have a very good reputation. He'd been in a little bit of trouble. His mother had to pull him in sometimes and get him out of trouble. He liked the ladies, but he liked the ladies that one had to pay for. He did get in trouble with the police on one occasion, was fined and had to do some community time because he was caught with a lady of that profession. He wasn't all that well liked. People often thought there was something a little bit not right with him. But Pearl, well, she fell for him hook, line and sinker. Which leads us to her cousin William Wood. Now, rumours were abounding that William and Pearl had something more going on than just friendship. But William swore that there was nothing more than friendship, that they had been friends since childhood. He was her confidant, and Pearl would tell him everything. And indeed, she did. When Pearl found out that she was carrying Scott Jackson's child, she went first to William. And she told him of the situation and asked for his help. William wrote a letter to Jackson, telling Jackson of the situation, asking him, what are you going to do about this and how are we going to fix this for Pearl? So the situation led to the fact that Scott relayed to Pearl via letters through William that he would meet her in Cincinnati and that this situation would be taken care of. Jackson organised for Pearl to come to Cincinnati to meet with him and sort the situation out. William assisted Pearl in getting on the train to Cincinnati. Interestingly enough, while all this was going on, Jackson had a conversation with his friend Alonzo Walling. Jackson did not want to get married. That was one of the suggestions Alonzo made to him, just marry the girl. No, that's not what Jackson wanted. Jackson wanted the child gone. He wanted the problem solved. Alonzo did tell the story of a conversation between himself and Jackson before Pearl arrived in regard to getting rid of Pearl completely, disposing of the body any way he could that it could not be discovered. Jackson and Alonzo attended the Ohio College of Dental Surgery. They roomed together, and that is how they knew each other. Alonzo Walling was 21 years of age when he first met Jackson at the school. Apparently quite an easily influenced young man.
if you play to his ego.
One story I wanted to touch on before we get more into what actually happened to Pearl. The story did make the rounds, and still does, that Pearl had the operation and had passed away just after the operation, and her body was disposed of by somebody else. This came about because of a lady called Anne Baker. A private detective approached Anne because he knew that she was someone you would see to obtain one of these operations. He spoke to her about Pearl. She said she didn't know Pearl, but then he asked her about the items that he could see that she had in her possession, which he believed had belonged to Pearl: a coat, some different trinkets and jewellery. Apparently Anne broke down and admitted to this private detective that she indeed had operated on Pearl, and Pearl had died, and a man named Trope had disposed of the body. This private detective went with that information to the police, but unfortunately the information was incorrect and untrue, and the police were quite angry with him, and he was later charged because he did give them false testimony. He added in a few little things that were not quite true, so he basically added to the story that he was told by Anne Baker. As it turns out, Trope was a complete concoction. There was no such person, and Anne didn't operate on Pearl at all. So despite the fact that John Stewart, the private detective, swore black and blue he believed her and he had seen Pearl's belongings, this was untrue, and he was charged with perjury. Which leads us to the eve of the murder. Pearl and the two men, Alonzo and Scott, were seen at a few different establishments in Cincinnati that night. They ended up at a particular saloon where Scott had organised to be collected from by a cab driver named George H. Jackson. George arrived at the saloon to collect them. They came out, they got into the carriage with Pearl. Alonzo sat up front with George, and Scott got into the buggy itself with Pearl. They gave instructions for George to take them to Fort Thomas, and they set off on the journey. They got as far as the Lock Farm, and this is when Jackson told George to stop. George's testimony to the police was that he watched Jackson and Alonzo take an arm each because Pearl was very unsteady. Stupefied was the word he used. He watched them walk her into the woods, and he waited as he was told to do. But he did hear some screaming, which disturbed him greatly. He got a fright and he took off. He took off running. He only came forward later once he realised what had happened and saw the newspaper articles. As for what happened to Pearl, well, horrific would be a good describing word. Scott and Alonzo took Pearl. She walked into the woods with them on the Lock Farm. It had been raining that evening, so the ground was quite wet and muddy, but it wasn't raining at this time. They walked her in. She obviously realised what Jackson had planned for her, and she took off running. They chased her down, held her down, and murdered her. And I don't need to go into the details in regard to that. You already know she lost her head. They also had ripped some of her clothing. The police had thought that it might have been of a sexual nature as to the reason why they did that, but she hadn't been tampered with. That showed up later in the autopsy, which I'll get to. They had Pearl's bag with them, and they used that to place the head into. They got in the buggy and they went back to Cincinnati. So before I touch on the clues and how the police came to establish who killed Pearl, I wanted to touch on a story that most of you probably know if you're familiar with Bobby Mackays. According to certain people, it's believed that Pearl haunts Bobby Mackays. The reason being, there is a connection between Bobby Mackays and the slaughterhouse, that Bobby Mackays stood on the land where the slaughterhouse stood, and also that apparently Alonzo and Jackson practiced satanic worshipping and whatnot in the slaughterhouse. The other rumour is that they disposed of Pearl's head down a portal of hell in Bobby Mackays. Finchtown is what Wilder, Kentucky was known as at the time of Pearl's murder. You will see by the map that there is a distillery, a drinking house, and a slaughterhouse. Now, the slaughterhouse was not there. It had already been demolished by the time that Pearl was murdered. That's been established. What was there was the distillery, the old 76 distillery. Quite a large property. It was by the railway line for obvious reasons, so that they could transport the stock, etc. And it ran by the Licking River. So in between where the slaughterhouse was and the distillery was, there was a little place called the drinking house. That's what it was known as, the drinking house, which was in some way attached to the distillery. When you overlay a map, a current day map, with the old Finchtown map, it is very evident that the drinking house is the property that Bobby Mackays is now built on top of. If you go downstairs in Bobby Mackays, there is the remnants. It's a very odd place. There's an old building that it seems that Bobby Mackays has been built on and around. I would ascertain, given the workmanship of that building, that was the drinking house, and they have merely built onto it and around it in coming years. The drinking house was approximately, you can see by this map, the drinking house was approximately 5 to 6 miles away from where Pearl was murdered on the Locks farm. George, the cab driver, gave details of the way he drove the 3 people to Locks farm, and he didn't stop anywhere along the way near the slaughterhouse area. He just went straight to the Lock farm towards Fort Thompson. So far as the men on their way back, they made a stop at a cistern, which is where Alonzo states he got rid of Jackson's bloody clothing. They did not get rid of the head. Both Alonzo and Jackson actually said that they threw the head in the river. However, there's another theory on that one based on the fact that I'll get to later on the clues. So the story of Pearl haunting Bobby Mackays because her head was thrown down the portal of hell is a stretch and not based on fact. It is based purely on people that have made up some stories to sensationalise her death, I guess. So let's leave Pearl out of the Bobby Mackie haunting stories because she's just not there, folks. If she was going to haunt anywhere, I'd go to where her body was found. So, yep, the story of Pearl haunting Bobby Mackays, let's just chuck that in the bin where it belongs. Let's get back to the clues and how they discovered who murdered Pearl. So the boys thought they were very clever. They removed her head. They thought they removed any evidence whatsoever that would lead the police to their doorstep. They were wrong. So the clues that they had were, well, firstly they knew that Pearl had fought for her life. They knew this because her left hand was cut quite badly. She fought for her life. There were footprints in the mud which indicated that she did walk in. She was walking, but they could tell by the footprints that she had been chased. So Pearl obviously realised what they were going to do and tried to escape. The other clue, she was wearing her dress, which could later be identified. She was wearing some expensive boots, shoes, that also could be identified. And the way that was done was brilliant, really, for the day. But the other things they tried were the bloodhounds, which were unsuccessful, and that is mainly in part to the fact that a lot of people were walking around the area, had touched Pearl's dress, etc. So the dogs couldn't get up get a good scent. The dogs did go as far as the Licking River, but nothing was found. There was some bloody clothing found in a cistern not far from where Pearl was murdered, and as it turns out, that was Jackson's clothing, and Alonzo admitted that it is he who placed it in the cistern. Now, to how they realised it was Pearl. The shoe that Pearl was wearing had the bootmaker's mark on it. So the police, pure Sherlock moment, decided to find the bootmaker and inquire as to how many of those boots he had made and whether or not he could tell them who had purchased the boot. And he could, and he did. And yes, there was only 2 pairs of that sort made. One pair belonged to a young lady still living in Greencastle, and the other pair were Pearl Bryan's pair. And so that is how they identified Pearl to a point. They still didn't have her head. So then they took Pearl's dress and they went to visit Pearl's mother and father, the family. Pearl's mother identified the clothing as being Pearl's. The family explained her involvement with Jackson, and they also explained her involvement, which worried them a little. They worried that William Wood may have been involved because they were such good friends. And that is what led the police to both Wood and Jackson, and then in turn to Alonzo. So the 3 men were arrested for the murder of Pearl Bryan. Woods was cleared relatively quickly. He had an alibi. He gave the police as much information as he possibly could in regard to Jackson, informing them of the plan that Jackson was going to fix the situation with Pearl because she was pregnant with his child. Originally, the police obviously didn't know how the men got to the Lock Farm until George came forward and gave them the evidence. Later, George's evidence would try to be sullied in some way by the defence attorney, saying that because he was an African American, he didn't know what he was talking about and the story was a lie. But it wasn't a lie. George was telling the truth. In the end, through questioning, they showed Jackson the bag that they had found. Now the bag with the head. How did that come into play? Well, the story went that he did take the bag one night into a saloon with him and handed it to a barman. The barman gave evidence in the trial. He said that when the bag was passed to him, something heavy was in it. He thought it was kind of like a bowling ball or something quite heavy because it rolled, and he just placed the bag down, thought nothing more of it. Alonzo and Scott Jackson came back later and retrieved the bag from the barman. They went somewhere, disappeared for about an hour, came back to the same bar, handed over the bag again to the barman, and at this point it was empty. It is said that the head actually ended up in the furnace at the college because they had a furnace that was there for the sole purpose of getting rid of bones, etc., from things that they did in regard to learning how to be a dentist. That is the working theory on what happened to Pearl's head. However, we'll never really truly know, because also Jackson said that he threw it in the river. So who knows? But anyway, that's where the bag comes into play. But the bag, they say, definitely contained her head, because when they examined it, it had blood in it, some of her hair, and it was shown to Jackson, and Jackson admitted that it was blood, admitted that he had had the bag. The other thing I wanted to touch on was her autopsy. There were actually 2 autopsies done. Firstly, they did an initial autopsy where they realised that she was 5 months pregnant. It was a little boy. They also established that no attempt at all had been made to terminate the pregnancy, and they put the cause of death as the beheading. However, it was later asked to have a look at her again for her stomach contents, because it came to pass that Jackson had purchased some poisons, cocaine being one of them, and it was established that Pearl had been drugged. There were signs that she had been drugged. So all of those things pointed to the fact that she had been murdered, and it had been thought out and planned. So Woods was cleared, but Jackson and Walling were not. Walling swore black and blue he did not kill her. He was there, but he didn't kill her. He didn't see that he should have to hang when he did not kill Pearl. But the governor and the jury did not see it that way. So Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling were convicted, found guilty of the murder of Pearl Bryan. It was premeditated. They got her there, well, Jackson got her there under the pretext of dealing with the situation, but he had every intention of doing away with her because he just did not want the problem. He knew that she wanted him to marry her. Walling was a willing participant in the murder and assisting with getting rid of the evidence. The family begged to be told what they had done with her head, to which both of them said nothing. They didn't know where the head was. They weren't telling anybody. They weren't being helpful at all. So Pearl was buried, unfortunately, without that part of her body. There have been stories over the years that they have found her head, quite a few different stories around the time that a skull was found, etc. But many skulls were found over the years. I don't know why so many people lost their heads, so to speak, but they were, and unfortunately none have ever been truthfully linked to Pearl. Alonzo and Scott went to the gallows, and there they hung. Their last words were brief. Walling said that they were hanging an innocent man and that Jackson could quite easily clear his name. But that wasn't to be. Both men hung until they were dead. Justice was served. But at the end of the day, let us remember Pearl as the vibrant young lady she was, respect her memory, and I hope that you got something out of this episode. Thanks for watching, and if you do have any questions, comment below and I'll do my best to answer.